And this is part of what draws me to oral storytelling as opposed to written storytelling, because it's an alive act of creation between the teller and the listener. There's no printed book. There's no this is the canon of how it goes. There's really just how you interact with the story, what you take with you. And and for example, if you were an oral storyteller and you retold The Little Mermaid, you would change things the way that they move and impact you. And this is, I think, the beauty of the art form. As I was saying earlier, some scholars, it's presumably as old as 50,000 years that some stories have been passed down. And it's always, if you're bored by something, if you hate something, you're not gonna waste your time retelling that same story, or at the very least, you're going to change it with the values that you have. And so that's what speaks to me is some of these stories are 100 years old, some of them 200 years old, some of them 1,000, and some of them really we can trace back 10,000 or even uh, we think that there's this one story from Australia that is 37,000 years old. And the way that we know about this is because it talks about volcanic eruption in a part of Australia where the last time any volcano erupted was 37,000 years ago. And and also from Australia, they have tons of Aboriginal stories. Australia is like the the motherland of oral storytelling tradition. And about 11,000 years ago, the sea levels were much lower. So Tasmania was connected to Australia. There was no water there, and you have all of this geological evidence, and you have these stories where there's no water between that land and the mainland. In the story, they have really precise routes that people are traveling, and so we think that yes, these stories have been faithfully told for at least 10,000, maybe 15,000 years. And even closer here in the Klamath Mountains, has anyone been to Crater Lake?
Yeah.
Okay, so at one point it was not a crater, it was a mountain, 12,000 feet tall, and it erupted. And the people of Oregon have this as an oral legend. And this eruption happened, I think 7 or 8 thousand years ago. And so somehow it's as though the historical memory of the human race can extend back that far. And so some of our stories really contain these values that have endured for that many generations. The other thing I love about oral storytelling is, back before we had computers, back before we had pen and paper, you really have such a limited memory. And so you're only going to commit to memory the things that truly matter to you. It takes up a lot of your own personal cash to really commit to this act. And so when I think about that in terms of what some people were really going to the effort to preserve, I just feel really touched about the lessons that are there. I touched on this a little bit tonight. I'm sort of in this chair speaking out to you, but I really make an ask of everyone here in the audience. And first of all, thank you so much for coming and attending this night. My name is Dawe Chou-Ren, and I'm delighted and also super nervous to share something that I'm really passionate about with you. Um, but I just have an ask of you as the audience to really view it as a co-creative act and to not assume that anything I'm telling you is the way the story has to be. That there's, I don't know, it looks like 20 people in this room. There's going to be 21 different stories heard in this room tonight. And the way that you hear the story really matters. I'll talk to people after the events and they'll say, I can't believe this person did that. And they'll use this super specific word. And then somebody else will be like, no, you didn't say that. They did this. They were running, not walking. And somehow, even though I'm recording it so we can check which words I did really say. Somehow people hear different words, and so every story is unique. And so I just want you to shift yourself into that context that you're also really a co-creator of the story. And so the way this night is going to go, I'm going to share a mythic story with you. You're going to hear it, and then afterwards we're going to do what's called feeding the story, which is the best part. So the story, as soon as it leaves my mouth, is sort of dead. I'm committing words to it. And you feed the story by letting it breathe inside of you, by letting it live inside of you, by sharing how it made you feel, by sharing what you felt, by sharing where you really entered the story and maybe where you left it, where you got frustrated with the story, or where you really fell in love with it. All of these things and the sharing afterwards, we're going to do as a group. And this is called feeding the story, really watering whatever part of the story has spoken to you and is starting to take roots. So, without further ado, I have a story that I first heard a couple of years ago, and I've never told it before. This is the first time that I'm telling it, and I heard this story in the woods of Vermont, and it really did something to my stomach. I remember I was at the end of the story, kind of just like looking at the storyteller like with this face, and he kind of like saw me, and I knew he saw me, but he wasn't asking me to share. And then finally said, "Okay, Dolly, what's going on? What's going on for you?" And I just had my stomach drop out in this story, and it's really stuck with me ever since. So I'm really delighted to share it with you. It's a true oral tradition, meaning I can only, in having tried to research this story many times, I've only found one place where it's been typed up online, and it's been typed up in about the space of 2 paragraphs. So it's really just a summary of the story. And so this is a true oral story that is alive only through telling and retelling. And as such, it doesn't have a name. I, I, I cannot remember the name that I was told when I heard it. For our sake tonight, we'll call it A Young Girl and Her Necklace. So this story begins with a town, a little village, really. And this village is on the banks of a great, ever changing river, a magical river. A magical river because every few years it'll change the way it's going. Sometimes this river is bubbling along merrily. Sometimes, in harder times, when times are dry, the river is really just a tiny little trickle of water, and you can't really hear it unless you're willing to walk outside the town entirely, walk past the very last dusty dirt road, past the crazy old man in his isolated house away from everything that's happening. And you walk and walk, and then, only then, can you just barely begin to hear the river. And sometimes the river is such that there's big black clouds in far off lands, and torrential rains are pouring down for months and months, and the river is slowly rising and filling, and there's great forces moving through the river's trees and boulders, and maybe even people and animals. And the river is moving with the tremendous crash of the will of the gods trying to orchestrate something to happen. And sometimes, as happens for this story, the river is making its way forcefully, but not causing too much havoc one way or the other. Maybe. The people of the river have a great tradition, which is anytime a newborn is born into their village, the baby is given a very special necklace. This necklace has a gold clasp around the back and a series of black river pebbles increasing in size until you get the final 4 weighty stones. One stone, ruby red, to safeguard the child's heart. Another stone, ethereal green, to guide their spirit to greater and greater heights. A third stone, jet black, for greater clarity and creativity of the mind. And a fourth stone that is different for every child. And it's the custom of this land that the parents will go searching as long as it takes in the riverbed for a final stone to complete the necklace. Not one that they have any kind of meaning about, but one that is intentionally meaningless for only the baby, the child, as they grow up to discover what is in that stone. Our young woman of the story is named Amara, and she is the daughter of two people in the town that have a very special role because they live on a stretch of the riverbank that is rich in clay, and together they fire pots for the village. You see, the whole village gathers every morning, walks down in a big procession to the river to gather water. You have your young macho men who are going to the two potters saying, "Hey, I want the biggest, widest, heaviest pot. I want a base that is absurdly thick because I want my friends to know that this is the heaviest pot of them all." And the two potters would say, "Okay, we can do that for you." And these macho men would run off with their big pots and stride into the river as far as they could into the rapids and try to put the whole thing at once and show their strength off that not even the river in this big pot can take them. And other people would go to the potters and say, "Well, I really just want the most elegant pot. I want one as thin as my eyelashes. I want one so thin that when I dip the pot into the water, it starts to sing. And I want one where if I happen to scrape the bottom of the river, it would shatter into 1,000 pieces. And in this way, I would show my friends that I was the greatest water collector of them all." So the two potters provided this service to the village, and then they had a daughter. And they gave her, for the fourth stone in her necklace, they found an opal, a brilliant opal, one that scattered every ray of the sun into 1,000 different colors. And Amara, wearing this necklace, was always scorned, always bullied, ever so slightly. It was a very communal tribe, but there was still that edge of trying to outcast her because this stone was so beautiful. The other women of the tribe wanted it for themselves. And Amara, maybe feeling some of this, was cheerful, was friendly, but also developed a passion of her own for reading. And the night before our story really begins, this is what Amara was doing. She was in the room of her hut, reading to herself, and went to bed perhaps a little bit too late. So she woke up the next morning, the sun was already out. She could hear the far off din of townsfolk already going to collect water. But not wanting to be so isolated herself, she sprang out of bed and thought she would take the back way and catch up with them. So she grabs her pot, starts running along the banks of the river, and she comes across a sight that she really doesn't want to see. She sees four girls in an isolated stretch of the river playing together. And it's these four girls that seem to want her opal the most. And she does what people sometimes do. She pretends to not see them. She kind of hides behind a tree, but it's a little bit too late. They've already seen her. But she does her hiding anyway. And the leader of these four young women immediately launches a devious and cruel plan without having to think about it. Immediately having this cruelty at her fingertips, she turns towards the other women and says, "Quick, quick, take your necklaces off." And she plunges her hands into the water, lifts up a heavy rock, and they know immediately what to do. They take their necklaces off, hide them under the rock, and she takes hers off, hides it under the rock too, and lets it down with a soft splash. And then, without missing a beat, turns up to where Amara is still pretending to have not seen them and says, "Oh, Amara, is that you? Ah, why don't you come join us? Well, if if you wish. We're just here playing together. We don't see you so often. We would really love if you would come and spend some time with us." Just the right words, so Amara cannot refuse. She climbs down the riverbank, wades into the water, and the leader of the four girls is so cunning. Have you ever met someone so cunning like this, that she knows just the right way to draw you in to doing something you're not sure you want to do? She just gives Amara a little bit of silence, and Amara, stumbling over herself, fills it by saying, "Gosh, where are your necklaces? Where are your necklaces? Because it was unheard of in the village to go anywhere without your necklace." The leader bowed her head and just said, "Oh, Amara, I guess you slept in again. A bunch of us at the main gathering, were giving an offering to the river god because the river's neither so dry nor so treacherous. It's moving just swiftly right now, and it's just so great, and we thought we would pay a tribute to the river god." And here she bowed her head just a little bit more and lowered her voice just a little bit more and said, "It's such it's been such an honor to give up our necklace to the river god and pay tribute in this way." And Amara, compelled by her compassionate heart, compelled by her generous heart, her hands, as if moving of their own accord, reached up behind her neck, undid her clasp, and they were standing right next to a swift moving channel of the river. She tossed her necklace in, beautiful opal and all. And as the river carried the necklace downstream, the rays of the sun hit it in such a way that she could see, really, the many colors of the opal scattering across the surface of the river, and it was a most beautiful sight indeed. And she was broken from this beautiful scene only by the very worst sound a young woman could hear, the sound of four others laughing. "Amara, you, you didn't really just do that, did you? Uh, You're kidding. I didn't know you were this big of a fool. Daughter of the Potters, of course, but to give up your necklace like this? Gosh, what an idiot." And the leader triumphantly reached her hands back into the water, lifted the stone, and the other girls equally triumphantly reached in, grabbed their necklaces, and clasped them again. With a look of malice, they started laughing and grinding their souls into Amara's, and with that cruel look on their face, they started sneering and calling her all sorts of names. And they didn't waste another second after that. They turned around and started hooting and hollering upstream back towards the rest of the village. What can you do in such a time but start to cry? And this is what Amara did. She bowed her head and just started to cry. She started to cry because maybe it was true that she was such a fool for having tossed away her birthright so easily. She cried for a bit and cried some more, and then something rather curious started happening. Her sadness turned into what we could call profound grief, as the full weight of what she had done sank into her. And as this change happened, Her tears grew larger, and these perfect spheres started rolling down her face, falling gently into the water. And it was there. If you would have been there, it would have been the most miraculous sight you could have seen, because the tears did not do anything to lose their perfect shape, but stayed that way, little bubbles of grief in the water. And as the sun hit them, they too started scattering its light in all different directions. 1,000 colors, pinks and purples and yellows and blues and greens. And as the river took them down the stream, a line, a beautiful line, a beautiful path of rainbow started appearing. And it was only when Amara had finished crying her last tear of grief that she opened her eyes, looked up, and saw the shimmering, beautiful, magical path. Sometimes, sometimes you do not need to wait when you understand something. Sometimes your feet can move of their own accord. Sometimes beauty enough and not just mere reason is enough to compel you to march downstream toward a goal you do not know about. And this is what seized Amara this afternoon. She started splashing her way down the stream faster and faster, not willing to let this rainbow path out of her sight. And sometimes the river would churn more. There were boulders and logs from previous floods, and the rapids would kick up and splash her in the face, and she could go that way no longer. So she would jump back out onto the shore and weave her way through bushes and under branches and sometimes she had to jump back in the river and swim very, very fast so she could catch up. And sometimes she traveled so far, so fast, she thought she needed some food. But there, the most beautiful shimmer of the water was still drawing her forward, still drawing her, and she found strength she did not know that she had. She kept going, and she began to feel fear because she wasn't sure she knew the way back to the village. And this bend she didn't recognize anymore. And did even the men on their hunting parties go this far down the river? Had anyone seen this river? Were there going to be monstrous people waiting for her around this next bend? And still, the river compelled her to keep going forward. And finally, she was sure that she was in a place she had never been before, because the river widened and it stilled itself into a single black pool of water. And this was a pool of water that seemed so unbelievably deep. Looking down, down, there was no muck or mud. It was very clear water, but it was so deep it just began to turn black. And it was here that she saw the last of the rainbow color disappear. She didn't know what to do. She was by the pool, the water up to her knees, and and it was very cold. Somehow the water here was much colder than before. And she thought, no, I, I can't possibly go back to the village without my necklace. I'll be laughed at. The other girls will just laugh at me. So she gathered herself and she pressed on another step, another 2 steps, and the pool was so deep that 2 more steps and the water was up to her waist, and here she really felt fear. But then she thought, no, I, I can't turn back now. My my mother and father, this was such a beautiful necklace to them. I can't tell them that I've lost this beautiful gift they tried to give me. And with this reason, she strode in a little bit more until all of a sudden her feet were slipping on the sand, and she wasn't so sure she had solid footing, and the water was up to her neck. And here the fear was really so high, it was paralyzing her entire body. And here she thought, oh my God, I really can't. I can't even see the colors anymore. I don't know. Yes, this is so foolish. You really think the necklace is down there? You really think you were so foolish to give up your necklace in the first place? And you're telling yourself that the necklace is at the bottom of this pool? And here she almost started to cry. And maybe she would have cried, and maybe she would have turned her back on this pool were it not for over this pool there was a big tree with a big branch, and there was a hawk, a red crested hawk at the top of this branch. And this hawk decided to hop down off of its perch and gather some speed going down to the water. And gathering speed as it skimmed across the water, it began to buzz her face with its wings. And it slapped a bunch of water and wind in her face, and this shocked her, and she didn't know what to do except plug her nose, grab one more deep breath, and she crashed below the surface of the lake. And it really, really, if you could have been there, if you were Mara, it would have felt like you were falling, 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 and falling some more. And this happened until another strange thing happened, and Amara noticed that her feet seemed to be touching something solid again. That actually, after all of this, she wasn't quite sure if it was mud or land, but there was something other than water. And she gingerly stepped one foot out, and and she couldn't see a single thing around her. But she decided to step another foot out, and yes, there seemed to be land, and she couldn't feel anything around her at all. And she thought for a second, maybe I better go back because I really can't see anything here, not even those rainbow colors. But when she looked back, well, there was no telling where she had come from. There was no magical ladder back up to the pool of water at all. Just the same darkness, the same slightly damp ground in every direction. And so she thought, well, I better I better go forward. Only she didn't know which way forward was. So using her other senses, she thought she smelled something and said, well, I'll just go in the direction of that smell there. Actually, well, I don't quite like that smell. It really smells like a rotten fish, or I don't know, a community house that doesn't do enough chores. But but maybe I better go there anyway. And she took another step, and she was convinced she was going forward, and she kept telling herself this, I'm going forward, I'm going forward. And she realized it didn't really matter because in this inky blackness, who was to tell her that this wasn't forward? So she kept striding, and the smell kept getting stronger. And she decided, oh, I really don't like this smell. I like some fish, and this is not one of those fish I like. This is really, oh, oh man, they ought to come hang out at our village where we know how to prepare some fish. This is this is really the. And then she couldn't pretend anymore. God, this is the worst thing I've ever smelled in my life. And it was almost making her cry. And she's plugging her nose, and but it's the kind of stench you can really taste. The kind that's coming in through your toenails, and you want to cut your toenails off because it's that yucky. And oh, and if she thought she was frozen moments ago in that pool of water, she was really struggling to move now. And uh, it really made her want to shrivel up into a raisin and just turn her insides out. And oh God, this smell. And she was closing her eyes, even though it didn't matter because she could barely see anything, and closing her eyes and trying to cover her ears and just going forward and forward and forward. And it seemed that she had hit something maybe soft, maybe hard, maybe both of them at once. And she hardly had time to figure out what was happening when two arms came down and picked her up. And just like that, Amara was face to face with the most hideous old woman she had ever seen. She was face to face with the grandmother of the cave. And Amara felt a strange source of relief because now she knew where the smell was coming from, and it wasn't just rotten fish. It was this hideous face of pus and sores, and oh gosh, is that a flap of rotten flesh hanging off her neck? Are there are there maggots crawling out of ah? And she decided she better not look anymore. And oh, it smelled so bad, and she thought she could feel a little drop of pus drip off of the old woman's nose right next to her mouth. And it was all she could do to avoid turning herself into a raisin at that very moment with magic that she had no longer, never before had access to. And the old woman, the grandmother of the cave, looked down at her with some kindness and said, a very kind but also scary question. Who are you? And Amara was really, after this pus landing next to her mouth, she wasn't about to open her mouth. Not right here. And anyway, she didn't want to taste any more of the smells. She thought she could just try to make herself small and wake up in her bed. And the old grandmother of the cave was kind, and she'd been around younger folk before, so she thought she would ask again, who are you? And this time, Mara tried to answer, but what kind of answer do you give to a question such as this? Well, I'm the I'm the son of two potters, and I sometimes play volleyball on the weekends, and uh, well, I sort of have OCD about cleanliness, but this didn't seem to quite be the answer the grandmother was looking for. She asked another question. Young child, who brought you here? And Mara's so frightened she can barely hear the question, answers the wrong question, in fact, and says, well, I'm here for my necklace. My necklace. My necklace. And the old woman knows that she's not going to get anywhere with this line of inquiry. So she stands there thinking about what next to ask her. And if Amara were a snarkier sort of person, she might say at this time, look, old lady, I really appreciate the questions, but I gotta tell you, I'm after something important here. I'm after something really important. You know, my village, they give us this very special necklace, and I've lost it, I've really got to find it, and I don't have time for these questions. I'm so sorry, but also you might want to check out. Do you know anyone that you can borrow cleaning supplies from? Because really, it's a bit much in this part of the cave. But Amara wasn't this type of woman, and so she just stood there, aware that if she said the wrong thing, this was the sort of situation that might end up in her getting eaten. So she waited, and the old lady looked down at her with love in her eyes and said, lick my wounds. Lick my wounds. And Amara, looking up at the lady, was somehow moved again by the compassion in her heart to stick out her tongue. And she scrunched up her eyes for sure. But that tongue made its out way out just a little bit, just like this. And the old lady lifted her up higher, lifted her closer, so that Amara's tongue begin licking her wounds. And that pus, let me tell you, Amara really tried very hard to turn herself into a raisin. She thought, I don't need the necklace. I just want to become a raisin. Please, whatever powers are there, please, I just want to become a raisin. Please, please. But still, she kept licking, and slowly her tongue came out just a little bit more. And she really started licking and cleaning those wounds and started sucking the pus out. And even the maggots, even the flap of rotting flesh off of the neck, she licked all under and over that, inside and out. And after what seemed like an eternity, she opened her eyes. And there, the old grandmother of the cave was beaming down at her. Thank you, my child. Thank you. Before Amara could say anything else, they were interrupted by the most fearsome sound. Vroom, vroom, vroom. And at this, the grandmother's eyes grew wide, and even she seemed to have some fear. She said, Young child, quick, come down. And she placed her down on the floor, and she said, Look, since you have licked my wounds, I will help you. This is Gobu, half man, half lizard, and that echoing sound you hears the fierceness and the ferociousness and the speed at which he beats his tail to swim through the rivers of this cave. He could be here any second. Come, you must make yourself even smaller, even still, even quieter than before. And she whirled her cloak around, hid Amara behind her, and Amara made her as pencil thin as possible. And then the old grandmother of the cave was face to face with Gorbu, and he was angry. Where is she? He was seething because he felt that some trick might be being played on him. I can smell her. Fresh meal, where is she? But the grandmother of the cave kept her composure and just said, I saw her. You're right, she was here. She ran off that way. And then off he went. And she unfurled her cloak and said to Amara, You must leave quickly now. He could be back any moment. But I will spirit you back up to the pool from where you came, and you'll see your necklace will be there. And she did this with a snap of her fingers, and all of a sudden, Amara was in the water again and swimming toward the fading light of the day. And she broke her head above the water, and all of a sudden, there was a necklace in her hand, and it seemed to be exactly the same necklace that she had tossed in the river, except now that the daylight was fading, she wasn't quite so sure if it was just because it was a little bit darker, but the opal seemed to be shining a little stronger. There was a little more color, a little more twinkle in it. And she hurriedly clasped it back on and stuck her head back underwater to say one last thank you to the grandmother of the cave. And while she was doing so, the grandmother said, Since you have had such nice manners, I will tell you one more thing. You will find your way back to your village very easily, so long as on the path back you will come across a great round stone. And my child, I just ask that you take this stone and you throw it back from where you've come. Do this, and you'll make your way back, no problem. So Mara swam again to the surface and climbing out onto the shore, found her way to a path, and somehow it was just as the old woman had said. There was a great round stone. And this wasn't the time for questioning. She picked up the stone with her two hands, tossed it back in the pool, and went back along her way, the shining light of her opal guiding her way through the forest in the night. And she climbed back into bed in the village very, very late. And this could be the end of the story were it not for the fact that the leader of the four girls was very nosy, kind of a nosy sort of person. And when she saw Amara late the next day, she just had to ask, um, Amara, is that uh, is that your necklace that you threw into the river yesterday? And Amara said, yes, yes, it is. And the leader noticed looking down at her necklace, and it seemed her necklace was not shining as brightly as Amara's, and that beautiful opal was somehow even more beautiful. So she had to know, Amara, is that really your necklace? And Amara, the sweet and kind soul she was, even to this woman who had shown her such cruelty, told her the truth and said, "Well, yes, yesterday I just went farther down the river than I'd ever gone before, and I came across this great still black pool, and I dove into it, and well, there's an old grandmother of the cave, and she gave me this necklace, and and the four girls were off, already running down the river, and they had no more time to hear. And Amara even would have told them the horror of what she had to do to get this necklace, but they were already out of sight. And the four of them marched down the river, and after a great deal of difficulty found their way to the black pool. And they dove in, as Amara had said, and they too found their feet on strangely dry land, and they too figured out that the only way to go when there's no way that looks like it's forward is to follow some other sense of smell or hearing or touch. They too found their way to the grandmother of the cave, and she smelled just as bad as before. This licking thing was no permanent solution. She smelled just as bad as before. Her pus was regenerating. And she said to them, "Lick my wounds." And the leader of the girl said, "No, no, I'm sorry. We're not here for that. We're here because you gave our friend a really beautiful necklace, and we just want to know how we can get the same. What where are the necklaces down here?" Lick my wounds. No, no, that's disgusting. I'm sorry, we're not going to do that. But the necklaces, do you have more of those necklaces? And the grandmother really would have tried for a third time. She, in her heart of hearts, would have given them a third chance, except there was a sound. And the grandmother just looked at the four young women and said, "My dears, you better start running." And they ran, and they ran, and they ran. And some say that they're still running in that cave even today. This story would have been lost to the grandmother and the cave were it not for the fact that in this river, in this pool, in the rivers, under the ground, in this cave, there lived a majestic fish people. And the fish together stitched together the story of all of this miraculous licking and not licking that they had seen. And they wove this beautiful story of the young woman and her necklace. And they told it for years and years until there was a young rabbit taking a sip of water down by a river. And this rabbit happened to hear this story, and this rabbit thought this was the most delightful thing ever. So he told it to all of his rabbit folk, and it spread across the land for generations and generations until there was a rabbit in the land known as Vermont. And out of this rabbit's mouth leapt this story, and into the ear of a man named Darren Silver it landed. And out of Darren Silver's mouth this story came, and into my ear it landed. And now out of my mouth it has leapt, and into your ears it has landed. That is the story of the young woman and her necklace. So you can take a deep breath or whatever you might do in such a time. Clear your head of the sight of pus or whatever you might want to do, or hold on to it. And just notice what you're feeling, what's alive in you, maybe where you really entered the story, where you saw yourself in the story. And yeah, I'd like to open it up for this part I said about feeding the story. And yeah, what's alive for you?
I appreciated when there was a lot of intense action in the story, a lot of energy that you brought to your embodiment of it. Whether it was like the very first that I noticed was the men putting the big pot in the river, and then there was moments of running down the river and entering the portal for the first time. Like I really got I was present, and then I got like really engaged during those times, and felt I was being pulled into the scene in a deeper way.
And which scene after that really did anything happen to your insides?
I was pretty disgusted at the first description of the grandmother's wounds and maggots and pus and whatnot. And I had a visceral reaction to an entirely imagined scene.
Me too.
But do you think the girl changed her compassion after this event?
What do you think?
So to me, this story is not yet finished because we don't know what happened to the main character.
How do you finish it in your mind? How is it finished in your experience?
I don't know, maybe the whole ordeal will make her realize who she is and be free from the burden of being so kind, so easy to trust. Or the other way is she could be traumatized by this event. So
It's some kind of easy trusting that gets her into the whole mess in the first place. And some easy trusting that gets her out of it too.
right.
I don't know why you would ever stick your tongue out even if your eyes are closed. Seems like not the right position to put oneself in.
Can you tell us what happened with the beautiful stone that was tossed back into the dark pool. Seems like it needs to come full circle. That stone,
Well, so
like a smoking gun, right?
this is really the beauty. This isn't, as I said, this is a true oral legend that, I tried to research it and all I found was two paragraphs. This whole story that I just told, written in two paragraphs on some website. Like, it's really a true oral tradition. So there's not, when I heard this story in Vermont, there wasn't, this is the Spark Notes version of the story with the motifs and the symbolism. Um, the way the stories live is there's moments that jump out to you and moments that sort of get seared into your memory, and these are the moments that are carried forth, and sometimes the moments that are seared into your memory are these sort of strange, almost irrelevant details, like what the heck, this whole thing with the pus and then throwing the stone back in the water, it seems like this hanger on. And when I think about it, these stories coming through thousands of years, you think about how many generations this story had to survive, and somehow this detail survives. Um, so all that's to say is I have an answer for myself, and I don't want to just drop it in. I want to hear, and this is what I mean by feeding the story. Is my interpretation of the story is not right? There's no one to tell us who's right, who's wrong. So if anyone has something jumping out to them about what that stone means, I'd love to hear it.
It hit the lizard person on the head as they were chasing.
Hmm.
The lizard person was trying to chase them, and then they threw the stone and it hit the lizard person.
So she actually ended up helping the four other girls.
Oh, I thought she threw the stone before the.
No, you're right. Okay, so she did throw it before
To help herself.
to help herself.
I think the stone's just all part of the magic. Like, she licked the old lady, and the old lady hid her under her cloak. The girls didn't lick the old lady, and she didn't hide them under her cloak, and so they didn't get to experience the stone and the enlightenment that came with the stone to find the path back to the village. And it's just all a part of, they didn't get to experience it. It's, maybe if they did, we would know more about the stone, but it's just all a part of, like, the magic.
I think the stone is a almost a representation of the bright stone that came from the necklace. Like, here's your necklace, but I'm gonna make it even more amazing. I need you to throw me the stone so that I can continue to add more.
Mm.
If someone else does come along to, trade off materials basically.
Cool. That really, I personally vibe with that. There's something about the exchange. I was talking to a friend who would hold a lot of like these free events and basically free therapy sessions, and he said it ended up not working. I think because people really had to pay. They had to give something in exchange for to really let the healing of the therapy land in them. And so I was doing them a huge disservice by doing it for free. Like they really had to free up that exchange. And I've never thought of this stone that way.
You mentioned a while ago about the land bridges that connected Asia, Australia, and so I live close around that area, and so when the land bridges happened, we had all ancient stories coming from China, from even the Dutch, the Spanish who conquered the area. So we all had these stories, and the way we look at these stories, ancient stories that was passed on from generation to generations, is uh, how can these stories were not meant to teach a scientific fact, but rather they were to teach relationships between you and nature and you and your fellow man, and things like social justice, ethics. How are you going to, yeah, and how we look at it is that there are two perspectives, what it meant to people then, and what does it mean to us today. So we have to learn to make those distinctions. I, when you mention the story, I see, the social justice of not not taking advantage of your fellow man, and being kind and be empathy, considerate of someone in need, even to the point of licking the wounds, and the reward of that quest, whatever that stone was, that was given by her parents, whatever that represents, that quest for it, she got it back, and it came back much more valuable, much more special. I think that was the value in that story.
Thank you. I think there's really a lot to unpack even in this small exchange. Thank you for adding in this piece about, when this story would have told, we as people had much different relationship to nature. And so this thing, like what you said, uh, about, this reciprocity, it's this, taking stones from the river to make this necklace, and then really this giving the materials back in really a trade.
There are many interesting parts of
Will you speak up a bit?
yeah, there are a lot of interesting parts of this story that jumped out at me. Um, as soon as the pots were mentioned again, I had almost forgotten the detail until it was mentioned, and I'm like, hmm. Like the use of that as the first sort of imagery in it, I think is a lot about like what's the vessel that a person represents, like what's the body that's being carried in the story, and like the comparison of the vessel of Amara versus the four girls who made fun of her and basically caused her to have this whole adventure. Um, so that detail seems very key in a very subtle way, which is really interesting. Like, what's the quality of the vessel that the spirit is within, and what can it endure? What can it withstand? Um, I found myself very surprised. I like almost didn't realize that we were not in water anymore in the cave. So it just transitioned, and I'm like, that's interesting. There are aromas underwater, and then there's all of this interaction happening with senses in sort of like a sensory deprivation chamber, um, which was just like very magical to me. Like because all of a sudden now I was like, oh, I'm floating in space, and then suddenly I'm here in this other thing. I'm like, how am I having these paradoxical experiences, which I think also really tied into the ambiguity of how you told the story. There's no this person is good, this person is bad. There weren't really any answers to anything. It's just the girl left her house and eventually she came back. And we don't really know how a lot of these things resolve, and the lack of resolution uh, kind of adds to the mystery and the magic of the story in that way. Um, I found it interesting too that the grandmother in the cave spoke much more slowly before the wounds were licked, and then like the licking of her wounds like enlivened her and actually gave her more. There's something about I think there's something too about like the saliva being a key element here, where it's like the liquid that comes from inside of us being transferred underwater in a space where like that liquid should be lost at the exchange of whatever that genetic information is inside of that. Um, yeah, my brain's kind of running amok right now with all of the like fun things to muse over.
Just start spitting them out.
Um, I mean, the jewel became more brilliant because the person underwent a process of personal transformation, tapping into the sort of idea of the purity of her heart. The fool is able to access like untold bounties because there's no agenda. They're a person who is just themselves, and then they come out much more brilliant as a result.
Yeah, Is she a fool? Do people think she's a fool or?
Fool doesn't mean stupid, by the way. Fool just means like they are what they are. Like they're unadulterated. They're very simply human. It's interesting too that we never know if Gorbu catches anyone ever. We just know that Gorbu is this lurking sort of shadow lizard beast that's hiding somewhere underwater. And it's interesting in a place where there's no water, you still hear the water moving from Gorbu's tail. So yeah, many interesting things. I'm also curious why a rabbit heard it from a fish.
You'll have to ask them.
I will go talk to them and find out. Yeah.
Where are people grinding for answers? Sometimes that's the most fruitful place to start with unpacking a story. Like what's that stone at the end?
So this is like a two-part for sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, will you go a little louder?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So like when I hear stories like this, like especially ones like passed down in oral tradition, like in my mind, my first thought is like, what's the takeaway from this? Because it got passed down, not just because it's interesting, but like hopefully there's a moral at the end, or like a teaching opportunity. And like what I thought was like really interesting about this story, at least for me personally, was like, at least in my head, this like it's not like one story. It's like five or six like fables kind of wrapped into like this one journey. Where like the beginning part is like here's a bunch of mean girls, and like the story could have ended. She like lost the necklace, and like that. The teaching moment is like don't trust friends, like they're really mean, like don't do that. And then there's like this whole other story. It's like going down the river, getting to the black pond, like the bird comes out of nowhere, and like maybe there's like something about nature there. There's the cave, right? I don't want to talk about us too much anymore, but it has like a whole other arc of the journey. So like in my mind, it's like fragmented into these like four or five like mini stories where they could have like started and ended there, and like that standalone good story that each had their own like moral or like takeaway from it. But like I'm still trying, just like struggling to understand like from beginning to end if there's like one cohesive theme that like I'm supposed to take away as like a listener, or like part of it was whatever story appealed to you the most, whatever moral you're supposed to take away, like pick that one, ingest it, keep it. Yeah, it's really interesting to me.
There's so many contradictions in these kinds of stories. Like I sort of alluded to before, it's like her open heart gets her out of the whole mess because she just licks the wounds without questioning any further. And it's also this incredibly like she just tosses her necklace, this incredibly important necklace, into the water. And so it's yeah, this story in particular has that really folded contradiction.
I think it's interesting that Amara and the group of girls, they both go in the river for the same reason. But Amara gets out. Does she get out because she senses a danger that the other girls are seemingly oblivious to, or is it because of some innate goodness for licking the grandmother? And I'm not sure. Maybe it's both, because she does seem to be naive and trusting to throw something that she cares about in the river. But I also think she maybe was more afraid in that moment than the group of girls because she was alone and they were not, and they maybe just didn't appreciate the circumstances in the same way. So I don't know. I don't know if it's probably both. It's interesting to me, and I wonder more about her character. It sounds like she's quite young. 'Cause you didn't tell us very much about her, and I'm guessing it's just not part of the story rather than a deliberate omission. So I wonder about her character, but maybe she's at an age where there just aren't many details because it's hard to describe young people.
I think there's something to piggybacking on what you just said. I think part of it is that Amara had pure intentions, in why she went after it. So the reason she felt so afraid was because she knew that this is something that had been given to her, so it had so much value and so much importance to her. And so she was willing to take risks and go after something that was, through this really scary journey, because her intentions and what was driving her was so pure. Whereas I think with the four girls, it was much more around vanity and shallowness and a certain um, maybe a status type symbol, and so therefore there wasn't an intention around it that was heart centered. It was the intention was jealousy, resentment. It was a different type of emotion and intention that was driving them, and therefore they weren't willing to take the risks and go as far as they needed to go in order to achieve it.
She was really kind of desperate, I think, Amara. Stuck in that pool, like, gosh, I've done this incredibly foolish thing. How can I return home to anyone?
I think the most beautiful part of the story is her tears. So it's not just the desire, right? In the story, the tears maintain the shape and become so beautiful and open up a path. So she's following that path. At the very beginning, it's not like she tried to get the necklace back. She's just following that beautiful rainbow path. And, yeah, when I hear you talk about this story, I would love to see not the stone, but her tears. And at that time, you would think with that kind of tears, she would transform to a different person, right? Like she grow from the sadness and turn into some kind of beauty.
Yeah, the tears, the true grief, as it's labeled in the story, opens a totally unseen path, this sort of invisible path through the water that's only seeable with these magical tears.
I think the part that stood out to me, the entire story was you're an amazing storyteller. From the very beginning of describing the river and how strong and powerful and important this river is, like to like the vessels. I really liked what you said about the symbolism of the vases being or the pots being the vessels, and I really like that. But the part that really like took my attention that I really related to was when she threw her necklace into the river, and then that's when the girls were like, when you said like she just heard the laughter of the four girls and that feeling of hearing that, because I feel like I relate a lot to Amara in that way of, and also what you said again of the agenda of things, and I'm going all over the place, but I was just telling him the other day, like I have this like kind of like anxiety of like doing the right thing according to others, like not like for example, we were at the movie theaters and I had to use the bathroom and I was like, should I go this way or should I go like who should I walk in front of? Like which way is the right way? And it stems from like being in like a child and doing my own thing and then the four girls being like, why would you do it that way? And she she did it and her tears were beautiful, her grief was beautiful, and she continued doing it. She continued doing her own thing. And it led to this amazing experience and she was fearful and it was scary and she was gonna give up and then the universe brought this hawk and like all this stuff and she just kept going and going and going and she just was true to herself, like, why would you lick a pussy old lady? She did it because she wanted to. She just did it herself. So that's what, and she ended up getting exactly what she was meant to get. And I think it's really beautiful that her tears looked just as like the color of the opal representing to me wearing your grief and your emotions on your chest, like wearing it there and just like allowing it to go and just doing your own thing and not being with the agenda and harnessing who you are in your vessel and
Cool. Thank you.
What it meant for me was that you know how every story has every hero has their flaw, right? So I was thinking, what's her flaw? Was she a fool? Was she, uh, too trusting? Or yeah. So I was thinking, what's that? And I was thinking, it seemed like the path to her subconscious, the monsters that are the fears that we have, the things that we won't do, that we have to pass through in order to, you know, create healing or create value from that experience. So I'm thinking, what's the what's the name of the monster? Gorbu?
Gorbu.
Gorbu? What's the Gorbu in my subconscious? What's the what's the old lady in my subconscious that I should give needs to? So so yeah, that's what I'm thinking. So that in the end, if I pass through that, I will have the same experience of healing from and restoration, and not only restoration, but she came out with a better necklace.
Yeah, I want to jump into more into that for about 10 more minutes, and then I just want to let everyone know I have a very short story, another short story that I want to tell after this. It's extremely short, but let's continue feeding this. And yeah, it brings us to that question of, yeah, a lot of these characters, Gorbu and the grandmother of the cave, could just be inner psyche characters for Amara, and yeah, to get a little more intimate with our lives, to bring the story really into our lives. It's like where have you been stuck licking the pus, or resisting licking the pus in your life? And have you seen that in your life at all? And are you willing to share where that lands?
I think the past is burnout at work. People got burned out. That's
Curious detail that jumps out is like pus is not actually the infection, it's the body cleansing the infection out of itself. So
Yeah.
the that's just an interesting thing to note.
I'll keep it in mind next time.
It's curious also just while you were speaking you made me think it's like it's a fear that the lizard brain, the amygdala, which is where fight or flight responses exist inside of the body. And it's curious too that different senses are used for different characters within the story. The lizard isn't actually ever seen by Mara or the other girls to our knowledge because she's hidden behind the veil of the cloak. And similarly, even though the details of the pus are all described, it's the smell that is the
I feel like
forefront.
he's heard this story before.
No, I actually never.
Drew studied mythology or something like this.
Yeah, I studied storytelling, but not this story particularly. But yeah, no, it's curious that different sensations are used in different places, and like why, like, and there's this whole like encapsulation of like both sense of smell and touch and sight and like sound. So they're all kind of brought together. And thankfully you didn't describe the taste of the pus, which was probably a generous gift on you. But yeah, it's very curious. trying to hold the broadness of all the things.
That's interesting because really uh, you know how we are affected. We are more emotionally affected by sound than sight, and we are emotionally affected by smell and taste. In fact, what we taste in food is really a function of our smell of the food. Because the tongue can only taste sugar, that means sweet, bitter, salty. That's all it can taste. But everything else is through the smell.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I want to return to this image of the grandmother veiling the young woman. This story, I think, is awesomely very female centered. There's not many male characters. You know, there's maybe her father sort of counts, and then there's Gorbu, who's uh, a lizard, but seems male, and and yeah, it's this image of this maternal grandmother kind of veiling the the young woman whose age we don't really know, and so I'll just sprinkle
It's
that.
very like feminine, like there's a lot of female characters, and then there's the water, which is like I'm talking about like energetically like feminine. The tears, emotions, and even opal is a more feminine stone, and it's very much like the feminine is about receiving and allowing and feeling, when the masculine is about doing and the opposite of that. So I would think of all of that more in terms of like energy and emotion. And going back to what I said of like the opal and her tears looking the same and holding that out, and like once she released it all, when she went through all that, the opal was brighter, like like how bright her tears were.
Yeah,
Earlier, you were describing like how I don't think you used the word naivete, but Amara's naivety kind of got her into the situation, but it also got her out. And you used the word fool, but I also see it as like maybe not directly, indirectly, she's willing to take risks. And in I think it's common for us to get stuck in life when we're not willing to take risks and we're really holding on to something tightly. And she was so willing to drop her necklace in the river and willing to lick the wounds and go under the cloak and things like that. And maybe there's something there about risk taking is what allowed her to go through this personal transformation and then also have an even more beautiful necklace on the other side. Whereas if she was so holding on to it and unwilling to take risks, she wouldn't have gone through any of it.
yeah, I love that. Cool. I really want to hear if there's more interpretations of bringing the story really to you about your own. Yeah, where have you been stuck at that threshold of having to do something like lick the pus that you haven't, that either you've chosen not to do or you have.
I think surrendering to the unknown is a big part of this story to me. Um, and I think I wanted just to clarify, like the fool is not a foolish person. Like it. Go read about Rob Reiner when he wrote Pee Wee Herman's Big Adventure, and that will clarify a lot of what I mean about this.
You mean like clown?
No, that Rob Reiner was obsessed with the tarot when he wrote that film, and the Fool was the first of the major arcana in the tarot, and Pee Wee Herman is the Fool, which is why he can get his bike back. Um, but so in this case, like the whole story, Amara is moved by something that is much larger than herself. Like it's just, and her feet started carrying her on of their own accord, almost, and all of these things happen that are sort of outside of her control, but immediately have an effect on the way she interacts with the world. And I mean, for me personally, I've been, I think, working a lot on letting go of the need to be deeply in control of a lot of things and surrendering to the mystery of life. And like, there's a huge amount of grief in letting go of like the old versions of ourselves I know at least for me, there has been. And so this process of surrendering to the spirit, which is something that you almost can't, like, you can't see it, right? You're in a deep well that where there's no vision and there's no perception of how to get out of it. And then your feet move of their own accord and you end up somewhere completely unknown. Um, so I think in a lot of ways this is a story about faith and trust as much as it is a story about like being good and kind and staying like true to like the essence of what your spirit is and how that translates in your own personal like forging to become something more than you were before.
There's also the moment right before she dives into the water, right before the hawk appears. It seems like I'm imagining her having kind of contradictory intuitions. It seems like her intuition was drawing her into the pool, and she wanted to go there, but she had some fear and trepidation about it. And the hawk was kind of the catalyst that made her follow the like desire versus the fear.
It's also interesting that rabbits have also been used as, you know, as the transitions between two kinds of worlds. Remember the rabbit, follow the white rabbit in the Matrix, and also, you know, how deep in rabbit hole can you go in Alice in Wonderland? So yeah, so that rabbit uh, interface between humankind and that world where Amara lived.
Going back to your question about like what am I avoiding or anyway about the wounds. Something in the story of the only path forward is like through the grief. You can't the path never would have been shown if she hadn't fully allowed herself to grieve. And I think I spend a lot of time avoiding that, the grief, and making it nicer this way and skirting around and oh, well, this is so fun. And the story calls me to like, yeah, being fully in the grief is the only way. So I think that's my path in connection to it.
Thank you. Yeah, I the part that really turned my stomach when I first heard this story was confronting where I was stuck and being asked essentially to lick some wounds and not being able to. So I hope even if just internally you carry that forward in your life and see where something needs to be fully gone through with. Yeah, thank you for this feeding the story. I love telling stories because I learn so much. You know, there's only one way that I can like maybe try to like read it different ways, and then I just hear people throwing things out that are really rich and enliven my own personal experience. We have time, and I can't resist telling this one more short story. It's very very short because it's about another old woman in a cave. The thing is, also, you know, hundreds, thousands of years ago, caves, I think, must have had so much different symbolism than to us now. Now it's like they're mostly just very scary. Uh, Back then, it was like also the only shelter. So this is something to keep in mind. Also, is cave is almost warmth and recovery and food. But this, yeah, this next story again, the names of these things are sort of irrelevant. It's the old woman weaving. If you find some elders of the land and you ask them just the right way, maybe you bring them a nice warm pot of tea, they might just tell you about a cave, a magical cave, where they'll say knowledge and true wonder in the world can be found. Now, if you ask some elders, they'll tell you to find this cave, you really have to go up to the tallest mountain past the clouds, and there, near the summit of the mountain, it'll open up into this great airy cave of knowledge and true wonder about the world. But if you go and you ask other elders, they'll tell you, no, no. Really, the way to get to this cave is to go to the darkest, scariest forest you know, and keep walking for 7 days and 7 nights into this forest until the bushes and the brambles are so thick you can go no further. And when you're at that point, you must go 1 day further, and then you'll come across a clearing with a great oak tree, and under the oak tree, if you dig with a shovel, you'll find a partially concealed cave, and in this cave, you'll find true knowledge and true wonder of the world. If you ask still other elders, they'll say that the first two have no idea what they're talking about, and what you've got to do is you've got to get down to Arizona, you've got to jump in the Colorado River and go swimming and find a little nook in the Grand Canyon. And when you've found a little nook, you just dip your head underwater, and right there is the entrance to your cave where true knowledge and true wonder in the world can be found. But they all seem to agree in my many years of searching for this cave that not so many people have found it in recent times. Not with our GPS and our Google Maps and our satellite imagery, not even with the new Apple Vision Quest Pro, has anybody managed to find the location of this cave. And that's too bad, they say, because in this cave really is knowledge about how to act when things in the world are sliding toward chaos. If you go in this cave, you see, you'll find an old woman sitting in a chair weaving. And this is the kind of old woman that seems to stand outside of time before the gods shot their long arrow of time beginning forward. Before that, somehow this woman was born. And if you ask her, she can't remember another person ever being in this cave, or actually there being anything but this cave. And she's been sitting there for aeons and aeons, passing the millennia, working on a very important project to her. You see, it's cold in the cave. It's cold in the cave, and she's been working on weaving an extraordinary coat. She's been weaving an extraordinary coat, many multicolors, and if you go there now, so I've been told, she's almost done, and there's gossamer parts and sheer parts, very thick furry parts, and all sorts of magic is woven into this cloak, and she's almost done, and she's just working on the very fringe of the bottom of the cloak now, and deciding on the final colors that she wants this fringe to be. And because she wants this project to be meaningful to her, she's weaving this cloak with the quills of a porcupine. And I don't know if you've ever touched or seen the quills of a porcupine, but she's chosen them because she likes the idea of making something that can poke you back, something that can bite back a little bit, something that she's got to be extra careful with as she's weaving this beautiful, most extraordinary cloak. And the quills of a porcupine, in order to use them, you've got to flatten them as a needle because they're long and cylindrical, and she doesn't want to be puncturing her cloak, so she's got to gnaw on them with her teeth, and she's been gnawing on these porcupine quills for several millennia now, and her teeth are about all gnawed down, just down to little nubs, and And sometimes she pokes herself in the gums, pokes herself in the lips with these porcupine quills, and still she keeps weaving, keeps sewing this cloak, and she's sewing the ferns on this cloak. And then all of a sudden, she remembers that weaving this cloak is not the only thing she's been tasked with in this cave. That actually, as long as she can remember, as long as time has existed, there's been a fire burning in the back of the cave. And every now and then, whether by desire or by integrity or by just sheer intuition, she remembers, gosh, I better get out of this chair. I better set my cloak down. I better put these porcupine quills down. And I better go check on the fire in the back of the cave. Because above this fire is a large black pot. And in this pot has been brewing, simmering slowly, a great stew. And in this stew are the seeds and the nuts and the grains and the plants and the flowers of all the things that sprout and grow upon this planet. You see, someone has to tend to this stew and give it a great big stir every now and then to ensure that this stew is just simmering and not burning, not overflowing. For who knows what harm could be unleashed onto the world if the grains and the seeds and the flowers and all the living things, if this stew were burned just a little bit. She has one of these intuitions or desires or moments of integrity and gets up and shuffles to the back of the cave slowly, slowly, slowly. And she can smell her way back there. Ah, the stew's not quite burned, but about to get there. It's a good thing I remembered. And when she gets up to go back to stir the stew, the black dog sitting in the cave opens its eyes because it's just been pretending to take a nap. It's not really been asleep. The black dog opens its eyes, sees that she's wandering back there, and slowly gets on its paws, trots over to her chair where this exquisite, wonderful, majestic cloak is lying on the ground. And because of the way she's woven this cloak, all of the threads interwoven and linked up together, because there's still this one end that's not been tied off properly. If only the old woman of the cave had tied her weaving off properly, because it's not been done like that, the dog just takes a little bit of thread in its mouth and shakes a little bit, and the whole cloak unravels. And her grandmother has given the pot its last stir. She walks very slowly. She's got all the time in the world. She walks very slowly back to her chair. And she doesn't see so well anymore, so she can't really tell anything is amiss until she reaches down with those hands that have been poked so many times with these porcupine quills. She reaches down to pick up her cloak, and as she does so, the whole cloak comes unraveling into one big, multicolored pile of chaos. And she sits there for a second, realizing what's been going on. She sits there for a second. And then, without a word, she picks up the last strand of this multicolored cloak, picks up another porcupine quill, and begins weaving once more. And soon enough, I tell you, soon enough, it's not been a few minutes before she's been weaving, and all of a sudden her mind is flooded again with these beautiful visions of the fringe that she's going to make to finish her cloak once more. And she weaves and weaves and weaves, begins turning this pile of chaos into her next cloak. And that is the story of the old woman weaving.
I think, yeah, one of the few things that happened to me was transferring to San Francisco is that, and as I travel up north, I found out that, yeah, as you go up north, they look at old women differently. They revere them. They call them as crones. It's the it's the female archetype, one of the female archetype. This symbol of knowledge, years and generations of knowledge. If the youth are known for innovation, inventing new stuff, uh, the mature and wise people, they learn to integrate, like like collecting little threads and putting them together to make something new and valuable. And that that thought that you said is actually the culture today makes all these things, and they're the keepers of knowledge. And yeah, I only learned that as I moved up north. And, in this world of Instagram, youth culture, I'm beginning now to seek those old wise women and appreciate their wisdom.
Thank you.
I think it's interesting how readily she started weeping again. It don't, like there was no mention of how she felt. She just realized that's the thing to do, and it's kind of like maybe the wisdom of her years shows her that your house burns down and you have to find a new house, and all sorts of things will happen in life that seems like such a shame that the dog undid it, but that's kind of the nature of the universe, is to create chaos and entropy, and like part of life is organizing as organisms, and it's just like that's the work to do. She started again.
It's a meditation
Yeah.
to start again.
Right. Yeah, like the sand art dumped.
Right,
Done
exactly.
again.
Is it the first time that this has happened?
Most certainly not.
Probably not.
So it's like she's hurting herself to prepare something she saw will protect her because she has to use her teeth, right? For to use the porcupine. And so it's like it's like you're hurting yourself too for something you don't really need.
There's two projects. There's, well, maybe three. There's weaving the cloak, making sure the pot of stew doesn't burn, and unraveling the cloak.
So
Which, if any, are more important?
stirring the pot is more important, but she's taking a risk, but she might forget the most important task and just keep weaving the coat. And when she's weaving the coat, she actually hurting herself because her teeth is going to rot out, right? And it never come, she would never be able to use her coat because the dog always on. So it's like a sad story. It's like you are chasing your own tail to no end.
What makes that a sad story?
Because she's hurting herself, right? Using, does she need to use the porcupine's needle to uncle?
Like what, like as you talked about, like one thing I thought was funny, I don't know what it means yet. Think about that like later. Like the whole reason she's like making the coat is because she's like cold.
Yeah.
And she's also sitting like pretty far away from the fire.
Right.
Like she
Right. Exactly.
could have
She
went
can
out
just
and did that right and like probably stayed warm instead. She's like doing something that's like unnecessary, it's like forgetting the key job. She also finished the other one. So I just thought that was interesting.
it's it's one of the most tragical.
It's also fun because it's the cave of wisdom.
Yeah, ironic.
So, so I happened to talk to one of these so-called witches and crones, and she's happy that she's finally had all this, you know, sense of aging. And she told me something that she told me as a young guy, you, you try to invent new things, but when you're old, like you said, the real innovation is transferring from one technology to another. In other words, integrating what you learn from another culture, another time, and melding, weaving them in. That's what she said. And she said, look at my cauldron. I put in all sorts of stuff there. That's the that's the brew of life. That's where the primordial soup is being made. And that fire represents the fire under the cauldron is, she told me that it represents wisdom, the light, the knowledge. That's really and there were other young women. They were saying, "I wish I could be as old as her." You don't hear that today, but that was the value that they were saying. That I wish I was as wise as her. So that was something really new and a new perspective for me.
Thank you. I'm gonna bring this to a close unless there's a burning. Anyone has one last thing to throw in the pot for everyone to go home thinking about? Is there anything?
I have a feeling that that cycle is what happens over and over again in the cave. So that the point is never really to finish the cloak, but to that when she gets to the last fringe is somehow always when the aha moment, I need to go stir the pot, is, and that is actually her way of telling time in a way, if there is such a thing of time. So it's kind of circular in this way. The way the dog just appeared, he's always pretending to sleep. So every time she gets up, he goes and does his part of the process. And so this is how it goes. And that was my sense of just this cycle. And that it was actually, there was no real goal to the cloak weaving.
I resonate.
Except keeping time.
Except to keep time, except to know when she had to stir the pot in a way.
There is this way of knowing just by sitting by the pot where you're warm and you can just keep stirring the pot. And there's this other way of sitting somewhere else and keeping time by weaving this cloak. Cool. I invite you all as you go home to continue just letting, sort of like old settlers panning for gold in a stream. You know, you sift out the parts of the story that seem irrelevant to you, and you're left with little gold nuggets for you. The parts where you feel something, you feel sad or angry or like why is it like that, or why didn't this happen? These parts have all of the wisdom for you. So yeah, I encourage you to just keep mulling it over and keep letting them settle in over the next few days. Again, thank you all for coming, spending your time here with me. I am gonna, if you want to hear more about events like this, I'm gonna have just like a spreadsheet. You can leave your email. Also, if you want to know just about things I'm up to in general, I have my personal website on the Eventbrite description, and I'm organizing a transformational gathering this July 30th to June, no, June 30th to July 3rd, up near Mendocino with a few really great friends of mine. We're gonna be doing things like this, telling stories, doing cool things together, and co-creating an emergent gathering, a culture of just being with each other, getting to know each other. So write to me also if that sounds the slightest bit interesting to you. Yeah, thank you again.